So there's a great cartoon out there on the old interwebs. It's got a teacher in front of a tree like this and some students. You've got a bird, an elephant, a seal, a penguin, a fish in a fishbowl. And the teacher says, to be fair, we all need to take the same test. Please climb this tree. Hi, it's Terra here with Blue Apple. Thanks so much for spending some time to talk about differentiated instruction. It's one of those topics that we all know we should do as teachers, but when it comes down to it and we have 4 weeks of material to cram into 2 weeks, it just kind of sometimes gets pushed to the wayside. So I want to give you some tips and tricks, some strategies to sort of make it a little bit more easy to implement, a little bit part of your natural routine, and hopefully that will make it something that you feel more comfortable with. A lot of these ideas I got from this book, Differentiation and the Brain by David Sousa and Carolyn Tomlinson. They are great resources for learning more about differentiated instruction, but I'll share some of the highlights with you today. So we know this is important, right? Because our students don't arrive as a matched set, needing the exact same thing at the exact same time. Wouldn't it be great if the birth date equaled the learning rate, right? But it doesn't work that way. So we need to make sure that if learning is really the center of what we want to happen in our classroom, that we make differentiated instruction a norm. So if we talk differentiated instruction, let's first talk about what it's not. It's not revolutionary, some new concept. It's been around since the days of the one-room schoolhouse. It's also not something else you have to do and fit into what you're already doing. And it's not the idea that you have to be everything to all students all the time. That's just not possible. It's really just a mindset that the teacher's role is not to just convey content, but rather to maximize learning. So that means if there's gaps in where a student is to where you need them to go, that the teacher is willing to find those gaps and fill them to make that student successful. Or if the content isn't feeling relevant to students, that he or she is going to find that bridge to make it relevant to their own personal lives or to something that matters to them. That's really what differentiation is, just a mindset to do what's necessary to maximize learning. All right, so how does it work? Well, I'm going to give a little bit of a framework that I use to differentiate instruction and share a couple of specific strategies that you can use right away. So when it comes to a framework, I like to think that you can differentiate for 2 things really. One is readiness and the other is interest. So when you talk about readiness, you're talking about, well, first of all, you have to make sure you understand that readiness does not equal ability, right? It's just your readiness to learn something. So think about it as the difference between where a student is right now and what they know or understand or able to do, and where you need to get them. What is that gap? What's the difference between what they know and where they are? Because you want to keep them in that zone of proximal development, right? That place where they're just challenged a little bit. That's where you want them to be. So what about differentiating for interest? Well, there are a lot of Blue Apple teachers out there engaging their students in high-interest projects. But for a lot of kids, school is just boring. And bored minds are not learning minds, right? So I want to make sure that we know how to differentiate for interest. If we have a group of students, we can be sure that there are common interests among that group and there are different interests. So if we differentiate for interests, it's our job to really think about what are those common interests, what are those different interests, and how do we use them to maximize learning. So if readiness and interest are the 2 things that you can differentiate for, what can you actually differentiate? Well, I like to think of 3 different things that you can differentiate: content, process, and product. So what does that look like? Well, if you're differentiating for content and readiness, let's say, you're looking at how can I change this content to best meet my students' needs? What if a student is having trouble reading? Well, you could provide picture or visual support. Or maybe you can highlight certain parts of the text for students who are having trouble finding the kind of main idea or meaning in a selection. Or maybe students who need a little bit of a challenge, you can find a more sophisticated book or a website for them to access that content. Let's look at interest now. If you're going to differentiate interest, it might look like, for content, it might look like maybe you're going to provide a book selection. So if you are looking at something like cause and effect, you don't have to give them just one book on cause and effect. Lots of different books will capture that particular skill. So give them that choice. Then they can pick the books as of most interest to them. Or maybe in a science investigation, you let them choose the variable that they want to change out, right? These are ways to differentiate the content for interest. Okay, so when we differentiate for process, if we're looking at readiness, that might look like thinking about maybe giving more or less complexity to the directions. Maybe you give the directions all at one time for some students, and maybe you parse out one direction at a time for other students. You can also differentiate for process by looking at interest. So thinking about where students work, give them some choice in that. Give them the opportunity to work in partners or alone. Some people prefer partners, some people prefer to work alone. You can also give them choice in how they prioritize the work, right? What order they get the work done in. Obviously, any of those things, if you find it's not supporting learning, letting them choose who they work with, for example, then you can kind of pull that back and make sure that you're providing the classroom environment that's going to maximize learning. And finally, when you're differentiating for product, if you're looking at readiness, that looks like maybe you give an example of what the final product should look like for some students, a good model, and others you leave it a little bit more open-ended. They have to think about that for themselves. When it comes to interest, I love to just say, show me what you know, and then give them the opportunity to provide that in a way that interests them. Or you can always challenge them to connect what they've learned to something that interests them. It's a great way to make connections. So when it comes to differentiated instruction, use this framework. You can differentiate for readiness or for interest, and under each of those, you can differentiate for content, process, or product. So let's explore a couple of examples that you can use to differentiate instruction. The first one is just the idea of choice boards or learning menus. And these have been around for a while. You can find lots of them on Pinterest, but it's just that idea of giving students some options. And it's a great way for you to build in some differentiation. The big thing I caution with learning menus and choice boards is that you don't make it busy work. You don't want to just add on stuff to do because the student is finished with their work. Make it all about differentiation. What do you need to do to maximize the learning and move each student forward? So if you're looking at what to do, maybe you could take the idea of a tic-tac-toe sort of learning menu. And when you're thinking about what are you going to put on this to really maximize learning, use that content, process, and product framework. Maybe 3 across the top are different ways to kind of approach the content. Maybe the ones in the middle are ways to approach process, and maybe the ones at the end are ways to do product. Lots of different ways. That's not the only way. Some folks do appetizers and main course and desserts. You can have all kinds of fun with it. You can make as many as you want required or optional. All of those are your choice, and you know how to do these. But mainly, it's just an opportunity to use that framework to make sure each of the choices are moving students forward and differentiating instruction. Another strategy to use is tiering assignments. And this is mainly used for readiness when you're looking at how can I give a little bit more rigor in a particular assignment or scaffold it a little bit more. So if you tier an assignment, here's an example. Let's say you had students do a lab. At the end of that, to kind of capture what they've learned, a tier 1 of that assignment might be asking a student to sort of recap what they did in the lab, show that they understood what happened in the lab, and maybe talk about why it's important, maybe apply it in the real world somehow. Perfectly good. It allows you to capture what they know and how they can apply it. But maybe for a student who's a little bit maybe they have the content already and you want to challenge them a little bit more, maybe they explain what happened in the lab, but they kind of think about creating something different. How might you change a variable and kind of predict what might happen if you change that variable? A great way to look at how to differentiate and tier assignments is to think about Bloom's taxonomy, right? If it's a basic understanding level or recall level, that's good for your students who are really struggling with the content. Then moving all the way up through evaluating, analyzing, and creating for those students who need a little bit more of a challenge. So I hope these 2 strategies help you up your awesome in your classroom. And if you want some more, check out our download for more differentiated instruction strategies. But most importantly, try them out in your class. Make them your own. Share how they work for you. Share your own ideas. We'd love to hear it. And if you find these videos helpful, please like and subscribe so we know to keep them coming. Thanks for all you do in your classroom, and see you next time.